I still remember that night, with a clarity that makes my chest tighten every time it surfaces. The first night I walked into her family's home as the official boyfriend, not just a name mentioned in passing. Not just someone she'd described over the phone, but a real, living, breathing man standing on that porch with flowers in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. Everything felt perfectly arranged, almost suspiciously so. The warm amber light through the windows, the smell of something rich and home-cooked drifting past the front door. Her mother's polished smile, gracious and unhurried, like she'd been waiting for me long before I ever arrived. But by midnight, when I thought the worst of it was behind me, when I thought I'd survived the evening, the bedroom door opened without a knock. She stepped inside, stood at the foot of the bed in the half-dark dark, and she said something, quiet, deliberate, without a trace of cruelty in her voice, that made one thing absolutely clear. If I stayed, I was going to lose Clara forever. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 35 years old, a structural engineer by trade, the kind of man who calculates load-bearing tolerances for a living, and somehow still couldn't calculate the weight of what I was walking into that weekend. I'm not a dramatic person. I don't tell stories for effect. But this one, this particular chapter of my life, has stayed with me in ways I am only beginning to understand. Clara Whitmore came into my life 8 months before that night. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party in late spring, the kind of low-key Saturday evening where nobody expects anything to happen, and then something does too. She was a psychologist, which meant she listened the way most people never learn to. She had this quality of stillness in the middle of a conversation, not passive, not checked out, but genuinely present in a way that made you feel like the only person in the room. I'm not usually the type who falls quickly. Life had already taught me to be careful with that. But with Clara, something just settled in me, like a foundation finding solid ground after years of shifting soil. We took it slow. We were honest with each other from the beginning. Or at least as honest as two people carrying old wounds can manage when they're also trying to be new to someone. She knew about my divorce. I'd been married for 4 years to a woman I genuinely cared about. And when it ended, it wasn't because of a single explosion. It was quieter than that. The slow erosion of two people who wanted different things and were too proud or too afraid to say so until it was too late. That failure had left a mark on me that I carried quietly. The constant low-level hum of not being enough, of being someone who had already proven he could wreck the things that mattered most. Clara never made me feel that way. She listened when I talked about it, really listened, not in the clinical detached way you might expect from someone in her profession, but with something warmer. Empathy that felt personal rather than professional. And I tried in return to listen to her, though she was harder to read than I was. There were edges to her story she didn't show me right away. Silences where I could tell there was more. Corners of her past that she navigated carefully around rather than through authority. I noticed, but I didn't push. I figured we had time. 8 months in, she asked me if I would meet her family. And that was when the careful construction we'd both been building together started to show its first hairline fractures. She brought it up on a Tuesday evening, in my apartment, the two of us sitting at the kitchen table with takeout and a half-finished crossword puzzle between us. "I want you to come to my mother's for the weekend," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not casual, not nervous exactly, but deliberate. Like she'd rehearsed the sentence a few times before delivering it. I told her I'd love to. And I meant it, but the word that followed me out of that conversation, the one I kept turning over in my mind as the week went on, was her tone. Not worried, not excited, deliberate, like she was making a calculated move on a board she'd been playing for a long time. I almost backed out twice. Once on Thursday night, lying in bed running through every version of myself that I imagined a woman like Margaret Whitmore, professor, mother, self-made, would evaluate and find lacking type. And once on Friday morning, standing in front of my closet trying to decide what a man wears to prove he's worthy of someone's daughter. I'm a construction engineer. I own flannel and work boots and maybe 2 blazers that still fit. I'm not from money. My parents were good, hard-working people who never owned anything that could be called a second home. My ex-wife's family had been politely indifferent to me, which I had always read as mild disapproval, kept under glass. What would someone who actually tried to disapprove look like? Clara called me on Friday afternoon. She could hear it in my voice, the way I was bracing myself. And she said the words I needed to hear and the words that, in retrospect, I should have paid more careful attention to. Ethan, my family isn't like that. Background doesn't matter to them. A job title doesn't matter. Just be yourself. And then, a half-beat pause. Just, be patient with my mother. She can come across as a little intense at first. There it was. The thing she almost said and then wrapped in something softer. I caught it. I didn't ask about it. I should have. The house was in a suburb about 90 minutes outside the city, a place where the trees were old and deliberately planted, where every driveway had been repaved at some point in the last decade, where the architecture announced its own seriousness without shouting. Margaret Whitmore's house was a 2-story colonial with white trim and deep green shutters. The kind of property that said old money without needing to hard shot. Well maintained. Impeccably so. Not a single dying flower in the window boxes. Not a hose left coiled on the walkway. Every detail managed. Clara squeezed my hand when we pulled up, and I noticed she didn't let go until we were at the front door. Whether that was for my comfort or hers, I honestly couldn't tell. Margaret answered before we knocked. She must have seen the headlights. She was dressed in a way that I can only describe as considered, not formal, not casual, but precisely calibrated. Dark slacks, a silk blouse the color of old ivory. Her silver hair cut short and sharp around her jaw. She was 60 but carried herself like someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that age was a negotiation she intended to win. She smiled at Clara first, a quick, private smile that contained a whole conversation I wasn't part of, and then she turned to me. Ethan, she said, Clara has told me so much about you. She hadn't asked a question. She'd made a statement, and she let it rest there like a chess piece on the board. The house inside was warmer than I expected. Literally warmer. Well, heated. But there was something about the arrangement of it that felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was in its place. The bookshelves were organized not just alphabetically, but by height. The throw blankets on the sofa were folded with a precision that suggested they had never actually been used for warmth. The photos on the walls were framed with a consistency that felt chosen. It was beautiful. It was also faintly airless, like a space that had been designed to impress rather than to live in. We sat in the living room with glasses of sparkling water, while dinner finished on the stove died shine. Margaret asked me about my work in the careful, attentive way that a woman with her intellectual training would ask about anything, not dismissively but with a kind of forensic interest. What projects had I worked on? What did that kind of engineering require? Did I see myself staying in that field long term? They were reasonable questions. Polite questions. But underneath the politeness was something else, a pattern I started to recognize after the 3rd or 4th exchange. She wasn't just making conversation. She was building a profile. Each answer I gave was received and filed and followed by a question that pushed one layer deeper. And then she got to the one I'd been dreading. Clara mentioned you were married before. Her eyes didn't change when she said it. They were the same measured, intelligent eyes. That must have been a difficult experience. Again, not a question. An opening. A place she was inviting me to fill so she could hear what I put there. I told her the truth. That it had been difficult. That it had ended because 2 people who cared about each other still weren't right for each other. That I'd learned from it in ways that were slow and sometimes uncomfortable. She nodded. She said, I see. And those two words somehow managed to communicate both nothing and everything. Clara was quiet through most of this. Not checked out, not absent. I could feel her beside me. Attuned to the room, the way a person is attuned to a room where something important might happen at any moment. When there was a pause, she would redirect the conversation. Gently, skillfully, the way a psychologist probably learns to do almost by reflex. She was managing. That was the word that came to me then and stayed. She was managing both of us, simultaneously, with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for a long time. Dinner was extraordinary, in the culinary sense. Margaret was clearly a talented cook. We had roasted lamb with herbs from what she described as her back garden, roasted potatoes, a salad that was almost unnecessarily precise in its construction, and a bottle of wine she'd selected herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew what she was doing. In another context, in a world where none of the subtext existed, it would have been a genuinely lovely evening. But the subtext existed. "Do you see yourself remarrying?" she asked, somewhere between the main course and dessert, with the same conversational tone she might have used to ask me if I wanted more water. Clara's fork stopped moving for just a fraction of a second. I felt it more than saw it. I said that I hoped so. That it depended on finding the right person and being honest enough with myself to know when I had. That's a thoughtful answer. Margaret said, "Most men in your position would be more definitive." She said the word like she was handing me a test result. Like there was a correct reading she was waiting to see if I'd arrive at. I didn't know what the right answer was. I'm not sure there was one. After dinner? While Clara helped clear the table, Margaret and I sat alone for a few minutes in the living room. The fire she'd lit was burning low now, and the room felt different without the activity of the meal to fill it. She asked me one more question during that interval, quiet, almost offhand, in the way the most consequential things sometimes are dry. She asked me what I thought made a relationship last. I said honesty, patience, the willingness to stay when staying was harder than leaving. She looked at me for a moment in a way that I couldn't decode. Not approving, not disapproving. Something in between that felt like a judgment I hadn't been given the criteria for. Clara came back into the room, and the moment dissolved. I was given the guest room, which was down a short hallway past the main staircase on the ground floor. It was tastefully furnished, neutral colors. A good mattress, the kind of room you'd find in a mid-range hotel that was trying hard. I lay there for a while going over the evening in my mind, running the tape, as I tend to do after anything that puts me on edge. It hadn't been a disaster. Nobody had been rude, exactly. No lines had been clearly crossed. But something about the whole experience felt like I'd spent 3 hours being quietly disassembled and reassembled without my permission. Like someone had taken all my parts out just to see how they fit together and then put them back in no particular order. I was close to sleep, that borderline state where thoughts start to lose their edges, when I heard it. The soft sound of the hallway door. Not dramatic, not urgent, just the whisper of a door being pushed open slowly by someone who was being careful about the sound. Margaret stepped into the room. She was in a robe now, and her silver hair was loose around her face, and without the structure of the evening's presentation, she looked, for the first time, like a person rather than a performance. She stood at the end of the bed. She didn't sit. She didn't turn on the light. She just stood there for a moment in the half-dark, and then she said, with a quietness that was more unsettling than any volume could have been, "If you love Clara, leave." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure I could. She went on Dutch. "I've watched her build herself back up from things you don't know about yet. I've watched her work harder than anyone I know to become stable, to become whole. And I've watched men like you, kind men, well-meaning men, come into her life and come undone in the middle of it, and take pieces of her with them when they went." She wasn't angry. That was the thing that unsettled me most. She wasn't cruel. She was precise, like a surgeon making an incision she'd already planned 3 times over. "You've been through one marriage that didn't work," she continued. "That doesn't make you a bad man, but it tells me something about your ability to sustain things when they get genuinely hard. Clara's life, the life that exists under what she shows you, is genuinely hard, and I don't think you're built for it." I remember thinking, in that moment, that I should say something, that I should defend myself, or argue, or ask her by what authority she was standing in a darkened room, telling me to walk away from the woman I loved. But I couldn't quite access any of those responses, because underneath the outrage, and there was outrage, a quiet, burning kind, was something else. The part of me that had always suspected she might be right. The same part that had whispered all these months that I wasn't enough, that I was already too broken from the last time to be what Clara deserved. Margaret left as quietly as she had arrived. I lay there in the dark for the rest of that night and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep at all. By morning I had turned the conversation over so many times, it had almost become abstract. Just words. Just a sequence of sentences. And then I would land on a specific phrase she'd used, and the weight of it would settle back on my chest. "Men like you," as if I were a type. As if Clara's future could be predicted from a template she'd already seen play out before Pwai. Clara was in the kitchen when I came out, and she looked at me with the particular kind of care that a person shows when they already know that something happened, and they're waiting to see how you'll choose to carry it. She handed me coffee, Dachi. She asked how I'd slept. I said, "Fine." We both knew that was a lie. I wasn't ready to have the conversation yet. I needed a few more minutes of ordinary morning, the smell of coffee, the sound of a spoon against ceramic, before I stepped back into what the night had left behind. But when Margaret came downstairs, dressed and composed, and acting precisely as though nothing unusual had occurred, something in me quietly made a decision. After breakfast, which was brief, a little stiff, conducted mostly in the minor key of careful small talk, Margaret went to her study, and Clara and I found ourselves alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in a way that felt significant. I put down my cup. "Your mom came to my room last night." Clara's face changed. It was subtle, the barely perceptible shift of someone who has just heard a sentence they had half expected and half dreaded in equal measure. She didn't ask what Margaret had said. She said, quietly, "I was afraid she might." That told me everything I needed to understand about the shape of what was beneath the surface of this family. Clara talked for a long time, and I listened in the way she had always listened to me, without interrupting, without rushing toward the part where I got to say something, just present. She told me about her father, a man she had worshipped as a child, a man who was warm and funny and present, right up until the year he wasn't. He'd left when Clara was 12. No drama, no screaming fight, just a gradual disappearance that turned one day into a permanent one. He'd told Margaret he wasn't built for the life they had, that he needed something different, that he was sorry, but the kind of sorry that comes pre-packaged with departure. Margaret had been left with a daughter to raise, a mortgage, a career she'd had to accelerate overnight, and a grief she'd never once allowed herself to fully process. She had rebuilt everything, with extraordinary discipline and extraordinary cost, and somewhere in the years of that rebuilding, she had made herself a promise that she would never let Clara be dismantled by someone the way she had been dismantled, that she would watch and evaluate and intervene if she had to, because the alternative, standing by and watching her daughter love someone incapable of the distance, was something she simply was not able to do. Clara's eyes were wet by the time she finished, though she wasn't quite crying. "She loves me," she said. "I know that. I've always known that. But loving me and trusting me to know my own life, those haven't always been the same thing for her." She looked at me then, steady and uncertain at the same time, which is its own particular kind of courage. "I don't want to lose you," she said. "But I also, Ethan, I've spent so many years trying to find the middle ground with her. And I don't always know if I can hold both things at once." I sat with that for a long moment, because she was being honest, and she deserved the same in return. And the honest thing was complicated. I thought about my first marriage. The way I had handled difficulty in that relationship, not badly, not cruelly, but passively, waiting for things to improve rather than working to improve them, letting the space between us grow, because confronting it felt like too much of a risk. I had told myself, at the time, that I was being respectful, giving her room. In the clarity of hindsight, I knew it was something closer to fear. Fear that if I pushed on the problem, I'd find out how bad it really was. And then I'd have to decide what to do about it. I'd spent 2 years after that divorce quietly promising myself that the next time something important was at stake, I wouldn't avoid it. I would stay. I would do the uncomfortable thing. I would be the man who faced a difficult conversation instead of the one who waited for things to resolve themselves. This was the test of that promise, and I knew it. Not an abstract test. A real one. Happening right now, in a house that smelled like coffee and lavender and old, patient grief. I found Margaret in her study. She was sitting at her desk with a book open, though I don't think she'd been reading it. She looked up when I came in without knocking, and something in her expression suggested she had been expecting this. I didn't sit down. I stood in the doorway and I said what I'd been thinking all morning without the softening I might have reached for the night before. "What you did last night wasn't protection." I told her. "It was control. And I think you know the difference better than most people, because you're smart enough to have studied both." She said nothing. She held my gaze with the composure of a woman who had held harder gazes than mine. "Clara is 31 years old," I continued. "She has a doctorate. She has spent her entire adult life helping other people understand the interior architecture of their own minds. And you went into a guest room at midnight to tell her boyfriend, the man she chose, to quietly disappear, not because you believed it would make her happy, because it would make you feel safe." The room was very still. "You're afraid," I said. "And I understand it. I genuinely do. I know enough about where that fear comes from to know it's real. But being afraid doesn't give you the right to decide Clara's future for her. It never did." Margaret's composure held for a long moment, and then something behind her eyes shifted. Not collapse. Not surrender. Something more like recognition. The particular recognition of someone hearing a truth they had known was coming from a long way off. Her father said something similar. She said, quietly, before he left, that I controlled too much, that I couldn't let things be uncertain. Her voice was even, careful, but underneath the evenness was a rawness that I hadn't expected to find. I told him he was making excuses for abandonment. Maybe I was right, but maybe there was also something in it. She closed the book on her desk slowly, like she was closing something else at the same time. "I don't want to repeat what he did to us," she said. "But I'm aware, more than you might think, that trying to prevent a wound can be its own kind of wound." I sat down then, uninvited, because the conversation had shifted into something neither of us had entirely planned, and standing felt wrong for it. We talked for nearly an hour. Not warmly. Not easily. But honestly. In the way that people talk when they've both dropped something they've been carrying, and are finally just standing in the same room, without props. She told me things about the years after her husband left that I suspect she rarely told anyone. The way she'd had to explain to a 12-year-old girl why her father's clothes were no longer in the closet. The way she'd reconfigured her entire professional life to make sure she was home before dark. The way she'd stood in doorways watching Clara sleep and made herself promises that were really just grief, dressed up as determination. I told her things too. About the marriage I'd lost and what I'd learned from losing it. About the particular kind of shame that follows a man who has failed at the thing he most wanted to do right. About what it had taken, and what it was still taking, to believe that one failure wasn't a fixed characteristic. That being someone who had been broken in one relationship didn't mean being permanently unsuitable for another. Joshua. We didn't arrive at peace exactly. There wasn't a moment where everything became clear and simple and resolved. But we arrived at something real. And sometimes, that's more valuable. What happened next was harder than anything that came before it, because it required a kind of courage that didn't belong to me. It belonged to Clara. She came into the study during a pause in the conversation. I don't know how long she'd been in the hallway, but from the steadiness in her face when she walked in, I think she'd heard enough to understand what kind of moment it was. She looked at her mother, and she said, carefully, not cruelly, but without giving an inch of it away, "Mom, I don't want to live your life instead of mine." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She looked at her daughter for a long moment with an expression I couldn't name. Not anger. Not hurt, exactly. Something older and more complicated than either. Clara wasn't finished. "I love you. I know everything you gave up. I know what it cost you. And I've spent my whole life trying to honor that. But honoring what you sacrificed can't mean sacrificing myself. It can't mean making every choice based on the fear of what might go wrong. Her voice was very even, the way a person's voice gets even when they're saying something they've needed to say for years, and they finally decided that the waiting is over. Margaret looked down at her hands. And when she looked up, there was something in her face I hadn't seen before. Not the composed, managed expression of the woman who had moved through the weekend like a chess grandmaster, but something softer and older and more frightened. The face of a woman who had built a fortress so carefully that she'd forgotten to leave a door. "I know," she said. Just that. Quiet. And those two words, coming from her, in that moment after everything, contained more than any of the long, precise sentences she delivered across the previous 24 hours. Nobody won that conversation. Nobody was supposed to. What happened in that room wasn't a victory for any one of us. It was the beginning of something. Slow, uncertain, requiring work from all three of us in different ways. I left the next morning, not because I was running. That distinction mattered to me, and I needed Clara to understand it. I told her before I drove away that I wasn't walking out. I was giving her space to figure out what she actually wanted, because I understood now that she was carrying things that needed to be worked through without me standing in the middle of them. I told her that I would be there when she was ready, when she'd arrived at her own answer. Not one shaped by pressure from either side. She nodded. She didn't argue. I think she understood that I was giving her something real, even though it didn't look like what either of us wanted in that moment. The 3 months that followed were the quietest of my recent life. I went back to my work. I ran audio. I spent some evenings with friends I'd let drift over the previous year, because new relationships have a way of narrowing the world down to one person. I thought about Clara constantly. The way she listened, the way she'd looked at me in the kitchen that morning, the way she'd stood in her mother's study, and finally said the things she needed to say. I didn't reach out. That was the agreement, unspoken, but real. She needed to take this at her own pace, in her own direction. I heard through a mutual friend that Margaret had started seeing a therapist each day. Not because she was broken. That word would have insulted her and probably been inaccurate, but because she was intelligent enough, once the fortress wall had been breached, to understand that intelligence alone doesn't rebuild what grief has quietly dismantled over decades. It takes the kind of work that can't be done from inside the structure you've built to protect yourself. I thought about that a lot. The irony of a woman who had raised a psychologist, finally sitting across from one, and letting herself be honest. Clara called me on a Saturday in October, 3 months and 2 weeks after I'd driven away from that house. I was making dinner when my phone rang, and I stood in the kitchen holding a wooden spoon and looking at her name on the screen for a moment before I answered. She asked if she could come over. She arrived an hour later. She looked the same and also different. Something settled in her face that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had been there but buried under everything she'd been carrying. We sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea and let the quiet between us be comfortable rather than tense, which itself felt like a kind of arrival. She told me what the 3 months had been like, how she'd spent the first weeks just existing without managing anyone or anything, which was harder than she'd expected, because managing had become so habitual that the absence of it felt like missing a limb. How she'd had some of the most honest conversations of her adult life with her mother, conducted slowly and imperfectly, and with a lot of stops and restarts, about what their relationship had actually been and what they both wanted it to become. How Margaret had said things that surprised her and things that didn't, and how the things that didn't surprise her sometimes hurt more. She said she had spent a lot of those weeks thinking about what she actually wanted. Not what she was afraid of losing. Not what she was afraid of causing hurt. What she wanted. "I want this," she said, quietly, looking at me across the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Not instead of my relationship with my mother, not as an act of rebellion, just because it's mine and because it's real, and because I'm done making choices based on other people's fears. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just looked at her. The woman who had listened to me when no one else knew how. The woman who had finally listened to herself. "Okay," I said, and I meant it the way the simplest words sometimes mean the most. We had dinner at Margaret's house for the first time since that weekend 6 months later. I. Different than before. Not performed. Not a test. Claire and I arrived without flowers and without rehearsed answers to anticipated questions, and Margaret opened the door and hugged her daughter first, and then looked at me and said, "Come in." Just that. No evaluation in it. Or if there was, it was quieter than before. The evaluation of a woman still learning to trust rather than control. The table was set imperfectly, which felt like a kind of peace offering. One of the wine glasses was the wrong height. The centerpiece was a vase of flowers that looked like they'd come from the grocery store rather than been arranged by someone with intentions. Small things, but I noticed them the way you notice when something that has been held rigid finally allows itself to shift. We talked about ordinary things, about work, about the season, about a book Margaret was teaching in her graduate seminar that Clara had read in college. There were no loaded questions. There were no quiet tests disguised as conversation. There was something that, if it wasn't quite warmth yet, was at least the honest predecessor to it. The thing that comes before trust. When people have decided to try, somewhere near the end of the meal, in one of those pauses that happen naturally around a dinner table, Margaret looked at me, just briefly, and she said, quietly, to the space between us rather than directly to me, "Don't let her get hurt." Not a demand. Not a threat. Something more human and more fragile than either. The words of a woman who had spent 20 years protecting her daughter the wrong way and was finally, with enormous difficulty, attempting the right one. I told her I'd do my best. Because that was the honest answer. Because promising certainty would have been a kind of lie, and we had all had enough of those. On the drive back that night, Clara was quiet for a long stretch of the highway, watching the lights pass touch-eyed. Then she reached across the center console and put her hand over mine. That was all. Nothing more needed to be said. I have thought, many times since, about the night Margaret walked into that dark room and told me to leave. About what I might have done differently if I had been a different kind of man. If the old fear had won. If I had packed quietly and driven away and told myself I was doing the generous thing. I understand now that the generous thing and the easy thing sometimes look identical from the outside and are nothing alike on the inside. What I know, what that whole experience taught me, in the slow and non-cinematic way that real lessons tend to arrive, is that love doesn't end with the feeling. It begins there. The feeling is just the invitation. What you do after you accept the invitation, the conversations you choose to have, the rooms you choose not to leave, the moments where you stay present instead of going somewhere safer in your own head. That's where love actually lives. That night, standing in the doorway of a strange room in a house that didn't want me yet, I thought I might be losing Clara forever. I thought the most honest thing I could do was walk away before the damage went any deeper. I was wrong. Not about the difficulty of what was ahead, but about what the difficulty meant. Because difficulty isn't a sign that you've chosen wrong. Sometimes difficulty is the sign that what you've chosen is actually worth it. That was the night, not any of the good ones that came after, not the first morning we woke up without anything looming over us. Not even the slow dinner with Margaret where nobody performed for anyone. That was the night we started learning how to hold each other. Not perfectly, not without cost, but for real. And for real, I have found, is worth every bit of what it takes. End of script. Approximately 5,100 words.